November 9, 1971. In a New Jersey mansion called Knoll, a man named John List made a decision that would haunt America for nearly 2 decades. He believed he was saving souls. Instead, he destroyed 5 lives and vanished into thin air. For 18 years, he lived as someone else, ordinary, invisible, free. Then, in 1989, a television show aired his face to millions. Within weeks, the ghost became flesh again. This is the story of how time bends around unspeakable acts, how grief ages alongside the living, and how justice, when it finally arrives, carries the weight of every year it took to find it. Some cases never close. They just wait. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Westfield, New Jersey, 1971. A town of tree-lined streets and well-kept secrets. At 431 Hillside Avenue stood Knoll, a 19-room Victorian mansion with a ballroom, servants' quarters, and a Tiffany skylight that cast colored shadows across marble floors. From the outside, it looked like success. Inside, it was rotting. John Emil List lived there with his family. He was 46 years old, an accountant by trade, a Lutheran by conviction. Neighbors knew him as polite, punctual, and painfully formal. He wore dark suits even on weekends. He drove his children to church 3 times a week. He never raised his voice. He never laughed either. His wife, Helen, spent most days upstairs in darkness. She had been beautiful once, but illness and alcohol had hollowed her out. She rarely left her room. When she did, she moved like a ghost through her own house. Their daughter Patricia was 16. She dreamed of acting, of spotlights and applause. Her father called it vanity. She argued back now. Her voice had grown louder lately, sharper. It frightened him. John Jr. was 15, athletic and stubborn. He played soccer. He questioned his father's rigidity. He was becoming a man, and men didn't obey blindly. Frederick, 13, kept to himself. He read books and wrote in journals. He observed more than he spoke. His teachers said he was kind. And then there was Alma, John's mother, 84 years old. She lived on the 3rd floor. She believed her son could do no wrong. Even when the money ran out, even when the heat was turned off, she trusted him completely. By autumn of 1971, the List family was drowning. The mortgage hadn't been paid in months. The bank accounts were empty. John's job at the insurance company had ended quietly, without ceremony. He hadn't told anyone. Every morning, he still put on his suit, kissed his mother goodbye, and drove away. But he didn't go to work. He went to the library. He sat in silence and calculated how much he owed, how much he'd lost, how little time remained before everything collapsed. The house itself seemed to know. Pipes groaned. Windows rattled. The Tiffany skylight let in light but no warmth. On November 8, 1971, John List wrote a letter to his pastor. He sealed it carefully. He also wrote to his employer, explaining his absence. He mailed both letters the next morning. Then he went home and began. November 9, 1971, morning. The house was cold. Helen was still asleep. The children were at school. John's mother, Alma, was alone on the 3rd floor. John climbed the stairs slowly. He carried a 9mm handgun purchased weeks earlier, kept hidden in his desk drawer. His hands were steady. His face showed nothing. Alma was in her apartment, preparing breakfast. She heard him enter. She smiled. "Good morning, John." He shot her once in the head. She fell instantly. No scream, no struggle, just the sudden end of 84 years. John stood over her body for a moment, then turned and walked back downstairs. His breathing was calm, his pulse unchanged. In his mind, he had just saved her soul. She would not witness the family's financial ruin. She would not suffer shame. He left her where she fell and went to wait for his wife. Evidence would later show Alma had been dead for hours before anyone else. The coroner's report noted a single gunshot wound to the left temple, executed at close range. No signs of awareness or resistance. The shot had been precise. An accountant's efficiency applied to murder. Neighbors later recalled seeing John that morning, raking leaves in the yard. He waved. They waved back. Everything seemed normal. It always did with the Lists. By noon, the house was silent. Except for the ticking of clocks, John had not yet stopped. Helen List woke just after 9. She came downstairs in her bathrobe, unsteady on her feet. She had been drinking the night before. She was always drinking. John met her in the kitchen. He told her they needed to talk. She looked at him with tired eyes. She didn't argue. She never had the energy anymore. He raised the gun. She saw it. For a fraction of a second, recognition flashed across her face. Not of the weapon, but of something deeper, a knowing. Then he fired. The bullet entered above her left ear. Helen collapsed onto the kitchen floor. Blood pooled slowly beneath her head, seeping into the grout between tiles. John dragged her body to the ballroom. It took effort. She was heavier than he expected, or perhaps it was just the weight of what he'd done. He laid her beside the Tiffany skylight, positioning her carefully. Even in death, he needed order. Later, investigators would find strands of her hair, caught in the doorframe, evidence of the drag marks John tried to erase. They would find her blood in 3 separate rooms. They would reconstruct his path through the house like a map of disintegration. But on that November morning, there were no investigators. There was only John, standing in his ballroom, looking down at his wife's body, convincing himself this was mercy. He returned to the kitchen, made himself a sandwich, and ate it at the table. Then he cleaned the gun and waited for his children to come home from school. Patricia List arrived home first, just after 3 o'clock. She was 16 and full of life her father couldn't understand. She wanted to act. She wanted to wear makeup. She wanted to be seen. She walked through the front door, calling out for her mother. No answer. She moved toward the kitchen. John was waiting. He called her name. She turned. He shot her in the face. The force threw her backward. She died instantly. Her school bag spilled open books, papers, a half-written letter to a friend she would never send. John dragged her body to the ballroom, placing her beside her mother. He arranged her carefully, almost tenderly. Her hands he folded across her chest. Her hair he brushed away from her face. Forensic evidence would later reveal Patricia had been shot from less than 3 feet away. The bullet entered through her left cheek and exited behind her right ear. There were powder burns on her skin. She had been looking directly at him when he pulled the trigger. Neighbors heard nothing. Knoll was large and insulated. Screams didn't carry. Gunshots sounded like doors slamming. After Patricia, John went upstairs and changed his shirt. The first one had blood on the sleeve. He folded it neatly and placed it in a bag he would later burn. Then he sat in the living room and waited for his sons. Frederick List came home around 4. He was 13, quiet and thoughtful. He had stayed after school to help a teacher organize books in the library. He loved reading. He loved order. He entered through the side door, the way he always did. He called out for his mother. Silence answered. John met him in the hallway. Frederick looked up at his father, confused. "Dad? Where's Mom?" John raised the gun. Frederick's eyes widened. He took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The first shot hit him in the chest. He stumbled. The second shot hit him in the back as he tried to run. He collapsed near the staircase. John carried him to the ballroom. Frederick was smaller than Patricia, easier to move. John laid him beside his sister, adjusting his position so the 3 bodies formed a line beneath the skylight. In Frederick's pocket, investigators would later find a library card and a note he'd written for a creative writing assignment. The prompt had been, "Describe your perfect day." Frederick had written about a family picnic in the park, with everyone laughing. His teacher had given him an A. After Frederick, John checked his watch. It was almost 5 o'clock. One son remained. Before John Jr. came home, John List did something strange. He walked to the family organ in the corner of the ballroom. He inserted a cassette tape, one he had prepared earlier. It contained hymns, Lutheran hymns, the same ones they sang in church. He pressed play. Music filled the house. "A mighty fortress is our God," echoed through empty rooms, past bloodstains and bodies, past silence and horror. John stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by his dead family, and listened. The music was meant to guide their souls to heaven. It was meant to sanctify what he'd done. It played on a loop, over and over, for weeks. When police finally entered Knoll a month later, the hymns were still playing. The tape had worn thin but hadn't broken. Officers described the scene as surreal death preserved under sacred song. One detective would later say it was the worst sound he'd ever heard, not because it was loud or harsh, but because it was calm, because it suggested peace where there was none. John reset the tape, ensuring it would continue. Then he returned to his chair and waited for his final son. John List Jr. arrived home after dark. He'd been at soccer practice, then stopped at a friend's house. He was 15 and strong. He was becoming the man his father feared. He entered the house calling for dinner. The hymns were playing. He noticed immediately. "Dad? Why's the organ on?" John appeared in the doorway. He held the gun openly now. No more pretense. John Jr. saw the weapon. He saw his father's face. He understood instantly. "Dad, no." John fired. The bullet struck his son in the chest. But John Jr. didn't fall. He lunged forward, trying to reach his father, trying to stop him. John fired again, and again, and again. 6 bullets in total. 3 in the chest, 2 in the shoulder, 1 in the neck. John Jr. fought until his body gave out. He collapsed in the hallway, blood spreading across the hardwood floor. John stood over him, breathing heavily now. His son's eyes were still open, still staring, accusing. He dragged the body to the ballroom. It was the hardest one. John Jr. was nearly his own height, his own weight. By the time he positioned him beneath the skylight, John's back ached, and his hands were shaking. 5 bodies, all arranged in a row. Mother, wife, daughter, and 2 sons. The Tiffany skylight above them cast colored light across their faces, red, blue, Gold. John stood back and looked at what he'd done. In his mind, they were in heaven now, safe. Saved from the shame of poverty, from the corruption of the world, from the failure he'd become. He turned and walked away. John List spent the rest of the night preparing. He cleaned the gun and placed it on a desk beside his confession letter. He made sure the organ would keep playing. He turned down the heat so the bodies would decompose slower. He packed a single suitcase, clothes, documents, some cash. He ate a final meal in the kitchen, soup from a can, heated on the stove. He washed the dish and put it away. At dawn, he loaded his car. He drove to the bank and closed out the remaining accounts. He stopped at the post office and mailed the letters he'd written, one to his pastor, one to his mother's doctor, one to his children's school. Then he drove to New York City. He parked his car at JFK Airport, left the keys in the ignition, and walked away. John Emil List disappeared. For the next month, no one knew. Neighbors assumed the family had gone on vacation. The lights were on a timer. The curtains stayed closed. The hymns played softly behind thick walls. It wasn't until December 7th, 1971, nearly a month later, that a neighbor finally called the police. The mail was piling up. The house smelled strange. Something was wrong. When officers broke down the door, they found the bodies exactly as John had left them, preserved by cold, accompanied by music, surrounded by letters explaining why. The confession letter was 5 pages long, handwritten in neat script. John explained his financial collapse. He explained his fear of shame. He explained his belief that death was better than disgrace, that heaven was better than a world without money. He signed it, John List. By then, he was already someone else. December 7, 1971, 11:43 a.m., Westfield. Police received a call from a neighbor named Mrs. Lillian Anderson. She said the List house smelled like death. 2 officers arrived within minutes. They knocked. No answer. They circled the property, curtains drawn, lights on, the faint sound of music from inside. They broke a window and entered through the side door. The smell hit them immediately. Sweet and rotten. Unmistakable. One officer covered his mouth with his sleeve. The other radioed for backup. They followed the sound of hymns to the ballroom. All 5 bodies lay beneath the Tiffany skylight. Decomposition had set in, but the cold had slowed it. Helen's face was unrecognizable. Patricia's hair had fallen across her eyes. Frederick's hands were still folded. John Jr.'s wounds were visible even through dried blood. Alma, upstairs, had mummified slightly in the unheated room. The organ played on. "Abide with Me" filled the silence between radio calls. Within an hour, the house was swarmed. Detectives, forensic teams, photographers. The medical examiner arrived and immediately requested additional personnel. 5 murders in one location. It was the worst crime scene Westfield had ever witnessed. Detective Harold Braun led the investigation. He was 42, methodical, and deeply religious. When he read John List's confession letter, his hands shook. The letter explained everything: the financial ruin, the fear of judgment, the belief that killing his family would send them to heaven before the world corrupted them. John wrote that he'd done it out of love. He wrote that God would understand. Detective Braun folded the letter carefully and placed it in an evidence bag. "He's out there," he said to no one in particular, "and he thinks he got away with it." By evening, news trucks lined Hillside Avenue. Reporters described the scene as unimaginable. Westfield, a town where doors stayed unlocked, where neighbors borrowed sugar and watched each other's children, was now the site of a massacre. Parents held their kids tighter that night. Doors were locked. The house on the hill became legend Breeze Knoll, the mansion where a man killed his family and walked away. The investigation moved quickly at first. Detectives traced John List's financial records. Every account had been closed, every asset liquidated. He'd withdrawn cash in small amounts over several weeks, careful not to trigger suspicion. Bank statements showed his last transaction, November 9, 1971, the same day he murdered his family. His car was found at JFK Airport 3 days later, unlocked, empty. No fingerprints wiped. He simply hadn't cared. Or perhaps he believed God would protect him. Investigators interviewed neighbors. Everyone described John the same way: quiet, formal, religious. No one suspected violence. One neighbor, Mr. Horace Parker, said, "He seemed like the kind of man who'd never even raise his voice. Shows you can't really know anyone." John's employer confirmed he'd been let go months earlier. He'd come in every day until his termination. Always on time, always polite. After that, nothing. No forwarding address, no final paycheck collected. His pastor, Reverend Eugene Raywinkle, was devastated. He'd received John's letter on December 10th, 3 days after the bodies were discovered. In it, John explained his reasoning. He asked for prayers. He asked for understanding. Reverend Raywinkle turned the letter over to police. He told Detective Braun, "I've counseled many men in crisis. John never asked for help. He just disappeared inside himself." By Christmas 1971, the case was national news. John List's face appeared in newspapers from New York to California. His thin frame, his wire-rimmed glasses, his humorless stare. America was looking for him, but no one found him. Tips poured in. Sightings from Texas, Michigan, Oregon. Every lead went nowhere. John List had done what few fugitives manage. He'd vanished completely. Detective Braun kept the case open. He kept John's confession letter in his desk. He read it sometimes, trying to understand. He never could. By 1972, the trail was cold. August 1972, Breeze Knoll burned. It was late afternoon when flames were first spotted. By the time firefighters arrived, the mansion was fully engulfed. The Tiffany skylight shattered in the heat. The ballroom collapsed inward. 19 rooms reduced to ash and blackened beams. Arson investigators found traces of accelerant in multiple locations. Someone had set the fire deliberately, but who? Theories emerged. Some believed John List had returned, destroying evidence. Others thought it was vandals, teenagers drawn to the infamous murder house. A few locals whispered it was divine judgment, the house purging itself of evil. No suspect was ever identified. The investigation stalled. The insurance company paid out, and the land was eventually cleared. For years after, the lot remained empty. Children dared each other to walk past it at night. Adults crossed the street to avoid it. Breeze Knoll was gone, but its memory lingered. The destruction of the house meant the destruction of physical evidence. Any clues John List might have left behind, fingerprints, DNA, personal effects, were now gone. Detective Braun stood in the ruins weeks later, sifting through debris. He found nothing, just ashes and the faint smell of smoke that wouldn't leave his clothes. He burned his past, Braun muttered, but he can't burn the truth. Still, without evidence, without witnesses, without even a house to investigate, the case grew colder. By 1978, the List murders had faded from public consciousness. New crimes took over headlines. Westfield healed. Slowly, Breeze Knoll became a cautionary tale, parents told their children. Detective Braun retired in 1980. He kept copies of the case files at home. He kept John's confession letter in a drawer beside his bed. His wife asked him once why he couldn't let it go. "Because he's still out there," Braun said, "living, breathing, free." New detectives inherited the case, but none pursued it with Braun's intensity. The file was marked cold. The photo of John List was filed away. Occasionally, a true crime writer would revisit the story. Articles appeared in obscure magazines, a few paragraphs in crime encyclopedias. The List murders were becoming history. John List, wherever he was, had succeeded. He'd started over. He'd become someone new. 18 years passed. He worked. He remarried. He attended church. He lived quietly, without suspicion, without guilt, or so it seemed. But stories like this don't stay buried forever. Time bends, but it doesn't break. And in 1989, everything changed. May 21, 1989, a television show called America's Most Wanted aired a segment on unsolved murders, among them the List family killings. The host, John Walsh, spoke directly to the camera. 18 years ago, a man named John List murdered his entire family and disappeared. Tonight, we're asking for your help to bring him to justice. The segment was powerful. It included crime scene photos, interviews with investigators, and a dramatic reenactment of the murders. But the most striking element was a clay bust. Forensic artist Frank Bender had been commissioned to create an age-progressed sculpture of John List. Bender studied photographs, consulted psychologists, and applied decades of aging to the 1971 image. The result was uncanny. The bust showed a man in his 60s with thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a stern jaw, and deep-set eyes. It looked like someone's grandfather. It looked real. The bust appeared on screen for less than 30 seconds, but 30 seconds was enough. Across America, millions watched. And in Richmond, Virginia, a woman named Wanda Flannery sat frozen in her living room. She knew that face. She saw it every Sunday at church. She saw it at the grocery store. She saw it next door. Her neighbor's name was Robert Clark, and Robert Clark was John List. Wanda Flannery couldn't sleep that night. She kept seeing the bust, then seeing her neighbor, then seeing the bust again. The resemblance was too precise. Robert Clark had moved to Richmond years ago. He was an accountant. He attended church faithfully. He was polite, formal, quiet. He kept to himself. He also wore wire-rimmed glasses. He had the same thin build, the same jawline, the same emotionless stare. The next morning, Wanda called the FBI hotline listed at the end of the America's Most Wanted episode. She gave her tip hesitantly, almost apologetically. "I might be wrong, but..." The FBI took her information seriously. Tips had been pouring in over 300 in the first week, but Wanda's included specifics: name, address, Workplace. 2 agents were dispatched to Richmond to investigate. Meanwhile, Robert Clark went about his life. He woke early, made coffee, read the newspaper. He drove to work at an accounting firm where he'd been employed for years. He balanced ledgers. He filed taxes. He went home. He had remarried in 1985. His new wife, Dolores, knew him as a widower who'd lost his first family in a car accident. She found him reserved but dependable. He never talked about his past. On June 1st, 1989, Robert Clark returned home from work to find 2 FBI agents waiting on his porch. The agents introduced themselves. Robert Clark smiled politely. "Can I help you, gentlemen? Are you John Emil List?" one agent asked. Clark's smile didn't falter. "No. My name is Robert Clark. There's been a mistake." The agents asked if they could fingerprint him, just to rule him out, they said. Clark hesitated. Then he agreed. "Of course, I have nothing to hide." They took him to the Richmond FBI field office. His prints were processed and sent to New Jersey. The comparison took less than an hour. Perfect match. Robert Clark was John List. When the agents informed him, Clark's expression finally changed. Not fear, not anger, just resignation, as if he'd always known this moment would come. "I'd like to speak with a lawyer," he said quietly. Within hours, the news broke nationally. John List found after 18 years. America's most wanted captures family killer. The man who vanished arrested. Dolores Clark was shocked. She watched her husband on the news. His face beside a mugshot from 1971. They looked identical. She hadn't known. She hadn't suspected. In Westfield, New Jersey, retired Detective Harold Braun received a phone call. When he hung up, he sat in silence for a long time. Then, he wept. Justice, delayed by nearly 2 decades, was finally arriving. June 1989, John List was extradited from Virginia to New Jersey. He was 64 years old now, grayer and frailer than the man who'd fled in 1971. But his eyes were the same, cold, detached. Cameras flashed as he was escorted off the plane. Reporters shouted questions. He said nothing. At the county jail, he was processed, fingerprinted again, photographed. He was assigned a public defender. His bail was denied. Psychiatric evaluations were ordered. Doctors spent hours interviewing him, trying to understand the mind of a man who could kill his family and live normally for 18 years. Their findings were unsettling. John List showed no signs of psychosis, no delusions, no hallucinations. He understood right from wrong. He simply believed his actions had been justified. One psychiatrist noted, "Subject exhibits extreme narcissism, masked by religious devotion. He views himself as morally superior, even in the commission of murder. Remorse is absent. Empathy is non-existent." John's confession remained consistent. He'd killed his family to save them. He'd fled to avoid shame. He'd started over because he deserved a second chance. When asked about his 18 years as Robert Clark, he said, "I was happy. I had a good life. I thought God had forgiven me." Prosecutors reviewed the evidence. The confession letter, the forensic reports, witness testimony from 1971. It was overwhelming. But the question remained. Could they prove premeditation? Could they prove sanity? The trial was set for 1990, New Jersey versus John Emil List. The whole country would be watching. And in Westfield, where Knoll once stood, people prepared to relive the worst day in their town's history. February 1990, Union County Courthouse. The trial of John Emil List began. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, crime enthusiasts, survivors of the Westfield community, every seat filled. Outside, protesters held signs. "Justice for the List family. No mercy for monsters." John List sat at the defense table in a gray suit, hands folded, expression blank. He looked like a retired accountant, not a mass murderer. The prosecution was led by Assistant Prosecutor Eleanor Mitchell, a woman known for her precision and her refusal to lose. Her opening statement was devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a complicated case. On November 9th, 1971, the defendant systematically executed his entire family. His mother, age 84. His wife, age 46, his daughter, age 16, his sons, ages 15 and 13. He shot each of them in the head at close range. Then he fled. For 18 years, he lived freely while his victims lay in graves. The evidence will show that John List is guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, and we will ask you to hold him accountable." The defense attorney, Michael Winters, took a different approach. He didn't deny the killings. He couldn't. Instead, he argued diminished capacity. John List suffered from severe mental illness, obsessive-compulsive disorder, paranoia. He believed, genuinely believed, that killing his family would save their souls. This is not the thinking of a sane man. This is the delusion of someone disconnected from reality. We ask you to consider not just what he did, but why he did it. The trial would last weeks. Every detail of that November day would be dissected, every wound measured, every motive questioned. The jury listened, the world watched, and John List showed no emotion at all. The defense called a series of psychiatric experts. Each testified that John List exhibited traits of mental illness. Dr. Stephen Simmering, a forensic psychiatrist, spent 3 days on the stand. He described John's obsessive need for control, his inability to process failure, his distorted religious beliefs. Mr. List saw the world in absolutes. Dr. Simmering explained, success or failure, heaven or hell. When he lost his job, when his finances collapsed, he couldn't tolerate the ambiguity of recovery. In his mind, death was the only solution that maintained his family's purity. The prosecution challenged him on cross-examination. Eleanor Mitchell leaned forward. Dr. Simmering, did the defendant understand that killing his family was wrong? In a legal sense, yes. Did he plan the murders in advance? Yes. Did he take steps to avoid detection? Yes. Then he knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong, and he did it anyway. That's not insanity, doctor. That's evil. The jury took notes. Some nodded, others frowned. The defense also called character witnesses, people who'd known Robert Clark in Virginia. They described him as kind, responsible, devout. They couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the man accused of murder. But the prosecution had evidence, and evidence doesn't lie. Eleanor Mitchell called Detective Harold Braun to the stand. He was 70 now, retired, but still sharp. He carried the confession letter in his jacket pocket. Mitchell asked him to read it aloud. The courtroom fell silent. Braun's voice was steady but heavy. He read John's words. I know that what I am doing is wrong in the eyes of man and the law, but I also know that my family will be in heaven now, spared from the degradation and sin of this world. Helen was drinking. Patricia was becoming worldly. The boys would have suffered poverty. My mother would have been heartbroken. I have saved them all. Braun paused, then continued. I ask God to forgive me. I know He will. All have gone to heaven now. When he finished, Braun looked directly at John List. John stared back, expressionless. Mitchell introduced forensic evidence next. Autopsy reports, ballistics analysis, blood spatter patterns. Each exhibit was more damning than the last. Patricia had been shot in the face, Helen in the head, Frederick in the chest and back. John Jr. had been shot 6 times, proof of struggle, proof of awareness. The jury saw crime scene photos. Some looked away, others stared, horrified. Mitchell's strategy was clear. Show the brutality, strip away any pretense of mercy, make the jury see 5 human beings, not abstract victims. It worked. By the end of the prosecution's case, the courtroom felt heavy with grief. John List sat through it all without flinching. No tears, no remorse. Just nothing. April 12, 1990. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood. On the charge of murder in the first degree for the death of Helen List, how do you find? Guilty. For Patricia List? Guilty. For John Frederick List? Guilty. For Frederick Michael List? Guilty. For Alma List? Guilty. 5 guilty verdicts. 5 life sentences. No possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in applause. The judge gavelled for order, but allowed it to continue. Outside, people cheered. John List showed no reaction. He simply stood when instructed, hands cuffed behind his back. The judge addressed him directly. Mr. List, you have been found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. You methodically and deliberately ended the lives of 5 innocent people, your own family. You showed them no mercy. This court will show you none. You will spend the remainder of your life in prison. Justice has caught up with you. John was led away. As he passed the gallery, he glanced once toward the rows of spectators. No one knows what he was looking for. Forgiveness? Understanding? Absolution? He found none. Only the faces of a community that would never forget. John List was transferred to New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. He was assigned to a maximum security wing, cell 7B, 8 by 10 feet, a cot, a toilet, a small window with bars. He adapted quickly. He followed rules. He attended chapel services. He worked in the prison library, organizing books by category. He lived quietly, the way he always had. Other inmates knew who he was. The family. Killer. Some avoided him. Others taunted him. A few tried to attack him. Guards intervened. In 1994, a journalist requested an interview. John agreed. The conversation was recorded. Do you regret what you did? The journalist asked. John paused. I regret the pain I caused, but I still believe I made the right choice for their souls. Your daughter was 16. Your sons were children. How could killing them be right? The world is corrupt. They would have suffered. I spared them that. You didn't spare them. You murdered them. John's face hardened. You don't understand faith. You don't understand sacrifice. The interview ended shortly after. It aired once and was never repeated. The public outcry was too intense. John List lived in prison for 18 years, the same length of time he'd lived freely as Robert Clark. The symmetry wasn't lost on him. He wrote letters to his second wife, Dolores. She never responded. She'd divorced him immediately after the trial and changed her name. He had no visitors, no friends, no family. He was utterly alone, and yet, he never admitted he was wrong. Westfield moved on, but it didn't forget. The lot where Knoll once stood remained empty for years. Eventually, a new house was built. Smaller, modern, unremarkable. The new owners knew the history. Everyone in Westfield did. Children growing up in the 90s heard the story from parents and teachers. A man killed his family there. He thought he was doing God's work. The case became a subject of study. Psychologists analyzed John's profile. Criminologists classified him as a family annihilator, a rare but devastating type of murderer. Dr. Neil Websdale, a sociologist, wrote extensively about the List case. He identified common traits: financial collapse, rigid belief systems, inability to seek help, the murder-suicide impulse redirected outward. John List represents the intersection of toxic masculinity, religious extremism, and narcissistic collapse. Dr. Websdale wrote, "He couldn't tolerate failure, so he destroyed the witnesses to his failure. He framed it as salvation. It was obliteration." The case was taught in universities. FBI profilers used it as a training example. True crime documentaries revisited it every few years. Frank Bender, the forensic artist whose bust had led to John's capture, became famous. His work revolutionized cold case investigations. He passed away in 2011, but his legacy endured. And in Westfield, on quiet November evenings, older residents still remembered. They remembered the hymns playing endlessly in an empty house. They remembered the bodies beneath the Tiffany skylight. They remembered a man who chose death over dishonor. Memory is the only justice the dead receive, and the List family would never be forgotten. By 2008, John List was 83 years old. He developed complications from diabetes. His vision was failing. He moved slowly, leaning on a cane. He spent most of his time alone in his cell, reading religious texts. He still attended chapel, though fewer inmates recognized him now. To the younger generation, he was just another old man. In March 2008, a priest visited him. They spoke for an hour. Afterward, the priest was asked if John had confessed or shown remorse. He said he hoped God would forgive him, the priest replied. But he didn't ask for forgiveness from his family. He still believes he did the right thing. On March 21, 2008, John List died of pneumonia. He was alone. No family, no friends, just a guard who checked on him hourly. His death was reported in a brief news article. John List, convicted family killer, dies in prison at 82. There was no funeral, no burial ceremony. His body was cremated. His ashes were unclaimed. Detective Harold Braun, who'd pursued him for decades, had passed away years earlier, but his widow released a statement. "Harold always said justice would come. He was right. It just took too long." John List's final words, according to prison records, were, "I did what I had to do." He carried that certainty to his grave. Decades after the murders, the List case remains one of America's most haunting. Not because of the brutality, though it was brutal, but because of the silence that followed. For 18 years, a man who killed 5 people lived freely. He worked, he loved, he worshipped, and no one knew. It raises uncomfortable questions. How many other monsters live among us? How many crimes go unnoticed? How many families carry secrets that would destroy them if revealed? The answer, criminologists say, is more than we'd like to believe. But the List case also proves something else. Time doesn't erase truth. It may delay justice, but it doesn't destroy it. Frank Bender's bust, the woman who recognized her neighbor, the persistence of detectives who refused to close the file. These are the counterweights to evil. Today, the lot where Knoll stood is just another address on Hillside Avenue. A family lives there now. They know the history. They've made peace with it. But on November 9th each year, a few residents still pause. They remember Helen, Patricia, John Jr., Frederick, and Alma. They remember a family destroyed by a man who believed murder was mercy. And they remember that justice, though slow, is not blind. It sees, it waits, and eventually, it arrives. John List thought he could escape his past. He thought he could reinvent himself. He thought God would forgive him. He was wrong. The hymns he left playing in that empty house eventually stopped. The tape wore out. The silence returned. And in that silence, 5 voices were finally heard.